Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Jessica with Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast, and we are here today with
Kathy Wang
to talk about Impostor Syndrome, which is a delicious title for a thriller, but you also had written Family Trust a few years back.
Yeah.
When did Family Trust come out?
Family Trust came out, and it's funny, I feel like time has lost some meaning. It came out, I want to say October 2018.
Which feels like 10 years ago.
Yeah, it does.
Right?
Yes.
So, which are both great books. Tell us a little bit about Impostor Syndrome.
Sure. Impostor Syndrome essentially asks the question, what if one of the world's most powerful female technology executives was in fact a Russian spy? So the spy in question is a woman named Julia. She is a Russian asset. She came over, her handlers had expected her to kind of just exist at a mid-range middle manager level in the US, but instead she's really risen quite high. And the book asks, what happens when she's asked to put her very, very nice by now American life in danger in order to continue fulfilling her requests to the motherland? Does she just obey orders and continue, or does she try to wrest back some control? Because at this point, she's a lot more useful to them. At the same time, there's a lower level employee at our company named Alice, who is a Chinese American immigrant who has noticed something strange with the data in her company and starts to investigate that. And that kind of sets off a cat and mouse chase between the two women as they try to figure out how to essentially preserve themselves and their jobs and their livelihoods.
I liked that the balance between the two of them. They were both very interesting, and they both had a lot going on. Alice has actually some things in her past going on that come up, and obviously so does Julia, because she's a Russian asset. It's not a spoiler to say that Alice kind of begins to figure out that Julia has something else going on early on in the book, because it's like literally in the book description. So,
Yes.
but some of that, at least at first, is kind of almost useful to Alice for some of her own purposes. And obviously the American dream, or how Julia has risen, is useful to herself. Reading the story, at least for Julia's story, two people came to mind, one being Elizabeth Holmes, and another one, Maria Butina, who was a Russian asset for many years and went to infiltrate several political groups. Were you thinking of any particular people when you were writing her?
I was not thinking about any particular Russian spies, I think, because in a way, I haven't really fully researched Maria Butina, but it seems like she almost was successful purely because the people she targeted were quite ignorant, like there's like this major warning signs.
Right.
Versus for Julia, I really just thought about some of the female executives that I've worked with or observed over the years who, in my mind are fully patriotic American citizens, but imagine them as if they were Russian assets. So I started, I think, from a place like very high competence and achievement, and then just thought about what would be different about their lives if they were in fact a spy.
What was great about it is that one of the things that sort of comes up throughout the narrative about Julia is, she's got this whole spy thing going on, but then the fact that she's a female executive that has risen to this level keeps coming up as well. And it looks at how, spy or not, female executives are sort of looked at, which I guess is kind of what brought me to think about Elizabeth Holmes at all, in general, because, it's funny when you talk about imposter syndrome, which is this psychological phenomenon that a lot of people like to reference, where people always think that someone's going to figure out that they're a fraud and that what they're doing is not really worth it. But, takes on a completely different place in the book. It takes on a completely different, meaning in many ways. Somebody like Elizabeth Holmes, she really like modeled herself and framed herself to appear to know what she was talking about, and had all of like had people build these machines that were not useful, and then it was kind of figured out. And I remember, when I heard about it, I felt bad for a lot of female executives who are really trying to prove their competency and have like actual imposter syndrome, and are dealing with being called, basically like names by the men who are like, well, why is she rising so high? And then you have somebody who rose high and it was all a fraud. And then looking at somebody like Julia, who came from really difficult circumstances and made it, and now has a lot of things in question about how she got where she got.
Yeah, precisely. And I think Elizabeth Holmes is really interesting because I think she both suffered from being a woman, as I think any female executive would, and she also benefited from it, and that there was, I think, a desire from the greater or broader business community for there to be a young, glamorous female executive of a technology company. And in a way, they anointed her that, and without doing a lot of their diligence there. And so in my book, I really wanted to explore that feeling that you are battling against these things, but you might be able to benefit from being anointed the one, but there's only room for one, right? Like if there's three, it's too many. So there's a level of internal competition there, I think.
With Alice's story, with her, there's a lot of different narratives that happen, but Alice and Julia are the two main ones in the story. And Alice kind of figures out early on that something's just not right with Julia, who is she went from pretty much being in an orphanage in Russia.
Yeah, like an institute. Yeah,
an institute, which there were, children who were almost being harvested, it seemed like, to see whether or not they would be useful in the future. And to becoming this female head of company for this technology company called Tangerine, which is like almost like a Facebook plus type company.
Yeah.
Where everybody does all of their business. What I was thinking of when was Tangerine specifically based on like a particular company?
No, I mean, I think I based it on a mix of the big ones, and the big 4 or 5 are always intruding on each other's businesses, so it's pretty easy just to mask it because they're all involved in search and in hardware and in software, so it's kind of a mix.
And you hear about breaches of these companies all the time, and like things like Cambridge Analytica, which was harvesting people's information, and it always amazes me, and I'm guilty of this as well, that people just stay on them. Every time there's a breach that comes up, or they're like, hey, this nefarious thing happened on Facebook, people are like, yeah, but I'm still going to order my Grubhub through it, and the beat goes on. That was almost kind of dealt with nonchalantly in the beginning, when with some of the characters, like, oh, well, there's going to be a breach. Oh, there's always a breach. Thinking about the way that we deal with technology to communicate in a very specific way.
I think the point about how we feel about breaches is one that I did want to address somewhat in the book, and that we get so many notifications that our credit card information was compromised, or our email passwords were compromised, and Facebook was compromised, and et cetera. And we kind of say, ouch, but then we just keep on using the services, right, as you say. And in a way, it's funny, I was thinking about it in terms of climate change, which is very similar in that to actually fix it or do something different, like it takes a lot of effort, right? And even in this case, like we probably don't even want to change our passwords, right? We're just going to assume that nothing bad is going to happen to us because these breaches or these attacks happen to a company as a group, right? And we are simply an individual, and the individual doesn't matter. And so in this book, I really wanted to take it down to the individual level to show how a larger breach might actually be targeting a specific person, and what the consequences of that are.
So with Alice and Julia, they were a very interesting balance as main protagonists. They both they Alice was first generation American,
Yeah.
but she grew up very involved in the lives of her parents, who were Chinese immigrants, and Julia was an immigrant herself. But and they both ended up in this company. Julia, do you think was Julia was it more beneficial for Julia as a white woman to rise to the ranks as Alice, who was an Asian Chinese woman?
Yeah, I definitely wanted to deliberately present two main characters that were both immigrants to the United States, but one was white and one was a minority. And so I think it's definitely a huge part of why Julia was able to ascend uh, in a way that, and it was also for me for the plot, right? Like I didn't necessarily, there's enough going on in her story that if I make her a minority, to make it accurate, I've got to address all the little racial interactions she had to kind of pass to get through there. And I wanted her story to kind of be more direct in that way. And so you can see it. And, Julia, she barely thinks about race at all. And I think that that's part of her persona. I mean, she's never really had to deal with that aspect of it. She's just been able, doesn't have a thick Russian accent, so she's been able to blend in quite easily.
Right, and I think there's even like a point where she's sort of suspicious of Alice, and she looks at her and she's just like, oh, she's just a mid-level Asian woman, like just kind of like lumps that whole group together and sort of dismisses
Yeah.
her, almost like what kind of threat could she really be? Um,
Yeah.
where really Julia's got a lot going on aside from the fact that she was put in this position to do this job and to infiltrate, American society in a tech company. She's got a fiance, and
Yeah.
she really seemed to, it wasn't even like this fiance was like, okay, you have to marry this person. She was sort of able to maneuver so she could find the guy she thought was most suitable for her situation. She has a child, and that comes up a lot because she's pregnant as the head of the company, and then comes back to work with her child, and she's living this life, whereas Alice had a guy for 10 years who she really thought was going to be the one, and unfortunately she just it doesn't work out for her, and there's a lot of supposed to's in Alice's life that for Julia it's like these almost effortless next steps.
Right. Yeah, I think that you make a very good point there, and it's very perceptive. With Julia, I think sometimes I read these stories or these articles from female executives or female politicians that have it all. And sometimes there's a little bit of smugness, I feel like, about how everything has worked out. And I did want that aspect to be for Julia. Like, it's worked out for her. She has a really handsome doctor husband, and really, no trouble having a baby, and just things happen. And I wanted that smugness in a way where things have always worked out for her, to show how jolting it is for her when things don't work out. And then for Alice, I just really wanted to present the other side, because it's entirely possible and actually quite likely that things don't work out for you. I mean, you can be in a relationship for years and it just turns out to be the wrong person. And yeah, like, you're now older, and you may or may not consider those years a loss. And that's a very normal way to be. It's normal to feel lonely. I think we all have experienced that much more in the last year. And so I wanted to present a character that is going through those things, and who is still trying to move forward in life despite it.
So you do have, like I mentioned before, a few rotating perspectives. How did you decide who you were going to give voice to in the story that is mostly, I mean, it's mostly Alice and Julia's, or Julia's and Alice, but who did you decide was going to have the narrative aside from them?
Honestly, I think that is more just instinct and who I wish to have to have be a larger character. So there is probably the third protagonist is Leo, who was Julia's handler. I think he was included in there just because I'm a woman and I enjoy writing female perspectives, but I always want to add a male perspective, even for my just a balance in how the story comes out. I just feel like it's a more balanced story that way. And it's actually a terrible habit of mine that I always want to include many different perspectives. And as I draft and as I edit, they get cut out until I have the least amount I think I can the most I can get away with.
Um, so a little bit about the difference between writing this and writing Family Trust. So did you
Sure.
start writing this immediately after you finished Family Trust, or did you take a little bit?
So I am very much like a button chair hours kind of writer where I feel like I have to compulsively write a little bit every day. And so I was writing, as soon as I finished Family Trust or the final edits on that, I switched immediately to another book. But I think I got through two complete manuscripts before I got to this book. So I did not start on this one right away. I mean, I wish the concept had come to me and the characters had come to me, but I actually had to work through two other like 100,000 word manuscripts before this one started.
What was the biggest difference then between writing a story like Family Trust and writing Imposter Syndrome?
So when I wrote Family Trust, I really did not think it was going to be published. I don't have an MFA, and I don't come from that kind of writer's background. So it was never something that was in my natural career progression. So, and once I finished it, I still had to, go to the slush pile of agents and cold query them and all that. So it was not something that I thought would necessarily be published. So you do have that complete freedom of it. You're just writing into the void. And yeah, if it doesn't get published, it doesn't get published, and you wrote this. When that book sold, it sold in a 2-book deal. So, I knew then that I would have to deliver a second book. So writing Imposter Syndrome, I knew that this was going to be like in the world, and thus I need to have certain things have to be done. Like it needs to have a narrative arc. You need to feel like you grow with the characters. I can't take it in a crazy, really, really crazy direction, which is actually kind of what I like to do sometimes. And so it was just a different process. It was a little bit less free, but in a way you do know, because you're aiming for a target, for a final audience, it does make it a tighter book in a way.
It was a really fast read, and I'm already hearing that people are loving it. And I think it's got a lot of audiences. I think it's got people who are what I like to call sci-fi curious, because it's not really sci-fi, but it's got like a technology angle to it that I think will appeal to fans of sci-fi or people who would like to dip their toe in it. And it's got like your spy story, and it's got just really good characters, which drive the plot along very quickly.
Yeah, I feel like the book it's kind of like you either like it or you don't, right? It's kind of one of those ones where you either have some level of interest in technology, right, or you don't. And I totally respect if you don't. I mean, we have enough of it in our daily lives, but yeah. So thank you for saying that.
I mean, I think like the technology in it though is just kind of relatable. Even if
Yeah.
you don't like technology, you could read a book like this and be like, "See, this is why I don't like technology." Or if you do, and you're one of those people who are like, "Man, breached again," you will read it and you'll be like, "Oh yeah, this tracks."
Yeah, I
um,
hope so.
yeah. So, are you working on anything right now?
Yeah, so I'm always working on something,
Like like you
I
like you
don't.
said, that's kind of a redundant question, because you literally just said you're a button chair always working on something.
I am, yeah. So I am. I don't think this is it though, to be honest. It's not like working out the way I want, but I just can't stop. I just feel paranoid. Like if I stop doing practicing in a way, then I'll never write again. And it's true in a way, right? Because you don't really know when that inspiration will hit. So you just have to be there when it happens.
How did you start writing?
It was honestly, it was kind of like a bucket list item. So I was pregnant with my second child, and I had my two kids quite quickly. So I just knew that when the second one came, it would just be, quite honestly, really difficult to do anything again for a while. So I started on January 1st, and I was due in July. So I wrote the draft super fast, and I was lucky enough to get an agent from that in the summer, and so that's essentially what happened.
That's I feel you on that. It is very difficult to get anything done after you have
Yeah,
a newborn, no matter how Julia tries to make it seem like it's
yeah,
just
yeah,
natural. Um,
yeah, yeah.
so, what do you like to read? What are some of your favorite books and even like TV shows? What do you usually like to consume?
I consume a lot of, I think mainly books. Again, my kids are 3 and 5, so I only recently started watching TV again. So I've been like
Right.
catching up on all the. So on the book side, I love nonfiction. I think one of the best books I read so far this year is Empire of Pain by Patrick
Mm.
Radden Keefe, who I think I've read everything he's written. He's excellent. But I love literary fiction. I do like some sci-fi. I have a hard time getting, like, if it's too technical, I do have a hard time. But I've been really into Adrian Tchaikovsky. Right?
Yeah.
The book is Children of Time, for anyone that
Okay.
wants to look that up. It's amazing. And that's been a very joyous thing for me, in that I think I was very much, again, because I don't come from that world, I very much just read what kind of, I guess, the media told me to read, and the media, and I thought I enjoyed literary fiction, so I would read literary fiction. And sometimes, as you know, you get like a book that they're like, this book is amazing, you read it, you're like, what, I don't really totally understand it, and then they say, well, genre is genre, it's not literary. and
Oh,
then
yeah.
and then you read someone like Adrian Tchaikovsky, and you're like, this person is amazing, like they are so great. And so that has been a really kind of wonderful thing for me, just to read outside of my normal genre, I guess. And I feel foolish, like I should have been doing it a long time earlier.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, really, I think genre does get sort of a bad rap, and that's even with, I mean, I think from the ground up, from children's up. And I think a lot more people would be readers if that was not really thrust upon them. Um, when they're emerging as readers. I mean, I sort of started to read because I actually enjoyed fantasy, and then kind of went back and then began to enjoy some literary fiction as well.
yeah.
But it's to say that the two can't coexist is sort of crazy.
Yes. And I totally agree with you. And I probably shouldn't say this as like an author who's currently trying to has a book coming out, who wants coverage from them. Librarians and booksellers have always been the source of the best book recommendations for me, because they're not in that publishing machine. And I would totally, they're not directly in that. And I would totally say that on the record, and that, there are certain books that I think that publishing houses decide will be big, that will be important no matter what, and that are literary or not. And I understand their perspective, and that it's a business and you have to label things certain ways. But that's where I think booksellers and librarians are the most important, because they read it all, and they give you like the true recommendations. And so Children of Time, which I've just been going on and on about, was actually, I think, a bookseller recommendation. I said, you know, I like this
Yeah,
book, and this bookseller was like, you've got to read this one.
yeah.
And it was just a wonderful discovery.
Yeah, I think like the weird thing about the pandemic has been that I, as a librarian, and some of my colleagues will agree, feel like we have gotten a better almost line to the publishing companies. They need to promote their books, and we're the original book influencers, I have grown to call us, because
Yeah.
literally our job is to be like, and also booksellers as well. Like our jobs collectively, but we serve different niches, is to be like, have you read this book? And
Yeah.
like we could put a book into the hands of an adult who then is like, I have to read everything by this author. We could be suggesting a gift that somebody will read a book and then go and buy a set from the bookshop. And
Yeah.
because there hasn't been anything in person, we've been really connecting with the marketing teams at the publishing houses. And one thing that's growing that I'm seeing, and this is to your point about, different genre fiction, is that a lot of the publishing houses are forming like imprints that are specific for genre. I know, like, I think Macmillan just started like Nightfire, which is horror, and like
Interesting. Okay.
HarperCollins, you have like Voyager, and Penguin Random House has a bunch of just different subsets that deal with different genres. So I think, and I hope, because a lot of authors are coming out and kind of discussing how they feel about it, that maybe the next generation won't feel that way. And again, this is like, I like Family Trust was really awesome, and I'm so happy that you got it published. Imposter
Thank you.
Syndrome, I think, is going to also click with a lot of people, because I think there are going to be genre people, lovers, who are going to connect with it and then sort of do the back around and be like, okay, I'm going to go back and read Family Trust, and it's going to open up new worlds on both sides.
Yeah, well, I hope so. Your word, your words to, what did they say? Your words to God's ears, or
That's what they like to. Yeah, yeah. Well, I want to thank you so much for doing this. When does the book come out?
It comes out on May 25th, so about 10 days.
All right. Well, we are looking forward to it. This is Jessica with Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. Our guest today was
Kathy Wang. Thanks so much.
Thank you. We are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.